Hi, I'm Ben Manchipp, and we're going to look at originality and creating more ideas in your painting. And we'll start by looking at a recent selection of my work. This is basically a watercolour technique, and the dark areas are actually acrylic, water-based acrylic. And I achieved that by painting down a resist and then pouring on the dark colour, the acrylic, into the gaps between the resist, and then when it's all dry, it's all scrubbed off. And some of it is retouched afterwards with dry brush. So you can simulate some of those textures, and then the orange and the fiery background is very traditional watercolour flooded on, and then coming back in with one or two touches of body colour for some of the local colours that occur in between the structure. Now this next painting is Venice, and not the typical view of Venice, and it's a very in-close composition looking at the details of this old print shop. And when I was painting it, it was a joy because it's classic watercolour, there's no mixed media, the only touch of body colour is right at the end where some of the netting goes over the windows, but that's actually watercolour, it's just used thickly. So rather than thinning it down, it's made semi-opaque. It's a joy to paint, full of fun, and a good example, I think, of looking for the unusual and not going for the immediate subject that an area might be known for. This painting is the gondola workshop in Venice. These gondolas, when they're out of the water, are sort of matte black, slightly shiny, but when the light catches them, you get this amazing contrast in the middle. And it gives you a glimpse of the real working Venice, and also the soft light in the middle above the workshop, where the light's just beginning to diffuse those buildings. This painting is Venice, my spiritual home, and it's my favourite building, which is Cadoro, House of Gold. It looked as though it was dissolving into the canal, and the subtitle of this was Venice Melting. Lovely building, and curiously quite limited in its palette. This painting is Upway in Dorset, and it's a subtropical garden. And the concentration is all about colour and all about scale. This painting is Puddles at Bosham, which is in Sussex, and really the concept here, or the drive behind a painting, is not to be dictated by the weather and by a conventional day, but to look beyond that, because you'll see wonderful effects and wonderful ideas will come with some of these momentary things that happen. Now what we've got here are 3 photographs that I borrowed from one of my group, and with permission, and this one has got a bit of tape over it because he didn't want to be recognised. Poor chap. These are fairly good photographs, technically quite good photographs of Corfe Castle. What I'm going to try and do here is come up with some ideas to develop this subject and find out different ways of exploring it, and trying to find a way of painting it which will be different from just copying the reference. Okay, I've already looked at this subject earlier and made 1 or 2 decisions that what I try and do, and sometimes I put in little notes for myself, which is to improve the light and make it a bit more dramatic, so I put light and drama, and these are the sort of studies that would find their way onto the theme board, and the theme board would be the collection from this work of what we're thinking about, what we're aiming to do. And clearly with Corfe we've got this nice high dramatic building on top of the hill, there's some rolling landscape, and we have paths coming towards us, and the typical things you find in the countryside with fences and fields and barriers and so on. And if I was just drawing straight from the reference, the first picture, it would be okay, but it would be fairly dull. And what I then try and do would be to develop that a bit further. Just draw loosely, you don't have to measure the frame, you don't have to be precise, you certainly don't have to sort of bring in mounts and start thinking about that. Quick scribbles, and you can change the proportion and change the shape. And keeping those things in your mind, perhaps the next thing is, well, maybe we're looking at something where we might emphasise the scale of the castle, and we might be looking at bringing things in the foreground. There's a rather nice gate there, so we might be looking at introducing that somehow. And it might be good if we could have a much more dramatic light. The sky is very bland. Maybe we're looking at putting strong side shadows in to give a direction of light, and maybe we'd be looking at some texture and drawing in the foreground, and maybe a real bit of drama going on here. And for me, that tone study, clever piece of finger there, that tone study already gives me ideas of maybe the light is going to be important, and how we generate that light we'll have to think about. But a gradation going from left to right already as a tone study creates a much more interesting picture. Now, getting a bit fired up now, I would go on and look at that, and maybe that gradation from left to right would be my starting point, and maybe I would be looking at a counter change from light to dark and dark to light, where this castle wall and some of the details cross the sky, and maybe I'd be looking at increasing the perspective, and maybe that gate would become a major feature. And when you're doing these roughs, you know, do experiment freely. I mean, it's only bits of paper, as we mentioned before, you don't have to get strung out on it. And we could say, well, perhaps we'll zoom in on part of that. Maybe the composition is going to be a close-up of the castle, and we'll have this strong direction of light again, and maybe we'll cut out all the foreground. Well, that's not bad, but I think one of the problems with that is it doesn't give a sense of scale. So I tend to favour these two. And what I'd try and do now is perhaps bring all this together in another tonal study. And, you know, drawing little arrows like this and making notes like tone and gradation, all build up a picture of how you may solve it. Working in black and white, very easy monochrome, nice fat piece of graphite. You don't have to have a pointy pencil, you certainly don't need anything limiting, but you can put a lot of tone down very quickly, and you can cover the ground. And what you're actually doing is painting with a pencil. Okay, now once you've got an idea of where you might be going with the composition, and we've got there fairly quickly, you might need to move on to a bigger scale. And I'll just get rid of those for the moment, and we'll draw up roughly the proportion that we've decided to paint to. And I'll start by looking again at my studies and my reference, and I'll try and plot in fairly quickly where the main parts of this composition could be. I'll look quite carefully at this little valley and some of the clumps of foliage on the trees that are there, and the relationship of the castle to the mound or the hill that it's standing on. But really it's a question of trying to get the scale of the thing, and that proportion in relation to the foreground, you know, is promising. I think I could probably make something of that, and this track that leads into the picture will be quite useful, and it's got a nice kink in it, a zigzag there. So I've got 1, 2, 3 main planes, and I can begin to think in tone that maybe that one will be obviously set back by being a little bit paler. I might increase the tone of that one. And at this stage, you know, picking up what we were saying earlier, using the pencil to paint with almost, and you're doing a tone study, but also you're exploring composition. And at this stage, if your mind is open to suggestions, all sorts of things will start coming in where you're looking at detail, you're looking at the contrast, you're considering the direction of light, and it was a fairly sunny but bland day, and the thoughts beginning to occur to me that maybe grammatically we change the light and we make it much more interesting. Maybe we make it evening or even nighttime. Obviously it's the back of this post, and maybe that would be an important feature. And if you move on the way you draw and the way you think, you'll move on your painting, and you start to get a bit more interested in it. And I think really when you're painting at this level, when you're aiming to paint better, you really ought to paint with a passion, paint the stuff you really love. You know, there's lots of time when you can do the mundane. So here you can be really exciting, change things. We've made that taller than it was in the reference. When Turner went to Tintagel, he made the mountain and the cliffs much higher to make the castle more dramatic. And if he can get away with it, so can I. I like this tone study so much as a sort of monochrome. It's made me think of maybe we could develop almost a monochrome painting. And when we were talking about it earlier, I was thinking of ways of trying to get that older, more romantic look into the painting. And for the colour study I'll work a little bit smaller because I want to work quickly, and maybe I would be considering a series of sort of monochrome paintings or studies, and warm browns and ochres, sort of Van Dyck colour would give me a feeling of age. And if I start with something like sienna, and I've got a Van Dyck brown, and I've also got burnt umber. Burnt umber is just a little bit warmer than Van Dyck, so it's halfway, if you like, between burnt sienna and Van Dyck. And I'll keep an ultramarine in the background for cooling it down. And what I'd really like to do is think very hard at the beginning about this direction of light. So maybe I'd start, and I'm using a rigger here, but it can be any sable, you know, a 2 or a 4. And looking at my tone studies, I might start by putting in the shadows first. And once again, it's not for anyone else other than you, so you can be fairly direct with this drawing. And then if I take the same colour, which was Van Dyck, and I'm looking at a tonal pattern that follows my roughs, maybe what's going on in the background there might be the next stage, and then the shadow that we indicated coming down the hill on the study, and there were some darks in here, and some of that foreground, maybe there's some light under that gate, and then it goes into a shadow in that corner. And if I go back to a stronger mix, I can suggest some of the detail in the shadows we spoke about, and there are all these lovely ridges going up on the fields, and those contours across the hill that supports the castle. And the last thing I'll do is I'll try and think about this sky. And we were looking at a source of light, you know, we had here, and I did sort of start with a kind of radiating light which is going to get darker on one side. So maybe what we're going to have here is some source of light. Maybe it's going to be the moon. And remember, we're changing it from daylight to evening or night time. That's much better. You're always waiting for these little moments when things are going to work for you. Now, at that stage, I'd need to work a bit larger, and almost certainly what I'd have to do is sit down and do a much more careful pencil drawing to explore what I'm going to do and the proportions. But just before we finish here, nice soft pencil, and because this is so soft, it's dissolved by the watercolour while it's wet, and it does allow you to draw into things, and you can explore ways of doing a line drawing. And it does occur to me that perhaps on the painting I could get a nice linear quality, and we may be looking at ways of expressing the really beautiful shapes that are found in this. Yes, and I think that would house point tick 10 out of 10. That gives me encouragement to move on now.